Picture a radio hiss cutting through static, a star's slow blink in the corner of a telescope lens, a graph line curving upward, promising everything or nothing. Progress often announces itself with data, cold numbers on mortality rates, literacy percentages, economic output, but it lands in your heart as a feeling, sometimes wonder, sometimes dread. Imagine the night sky over Providence, Rhode Island, circa 1920. A young H P Lovecraft peers through his telescope, mapping nebulae and tracing the paths of distant worlds. He's awed, certainly, but the awe carries a weight, because the universe he's studying neither knows nor cares that he exists. The more he discovers, the smaller he feels. To Lovecraft, every new cosmic truth was also a diminishment, a reminder that humanity occupies no privileged position in the grand machinery of existence. As he would later write, the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. But what if it's not just the unknown we fear? What if it's the known, the realization that our story of progress, our narrative of climbing ever upward, might be writing us out of the center entirely? This film follows a simple tension. Does progress save us or strip us of meaning? We'll use Lovecraft's philosophy of cosmicism, the view that the universe is vast, indifferent, and humans are cosmically insignificant, as a mirror to examine our own age. An age of artificial intelligence that learns faster than we can audit it, of gene-editing tools that rewrite the code of life, of space ambitions that promise either salvation or the export of our worst impulses to new worlds. We're not doing this because Lovecraft was right about people. He held dehumanizing, racist views we'll address head-on, but because he was disturbingly clear about the abyss that opens when capability outpaces meaning. Along the way, we'll test the story of progress against history's inconvenient chapters. We'll examine the psychology of dread, the cognitive machinery that transforms uncertainty into existential fear. And we'll look at the propaganda apparatus, the storytelling engines that sell both salvation and despair, often to the same audience. Jacques Ellul argued in 1965 that modern propaganda doesn't just lie. It creates an environment of messages so total that certain choices feel inevitable. Robert Nisbet traced how the idea of progress itself became a secular religion over centuries, complete with its own dogmas and heresies. The question before us isn't whether to progress. You can't unlearn antibiotics or semiconductors. The question is whether we can do it without losing the plot, without forgetting why we're climbing in the first place, or noticing too late that the staircase has become a treadmill. What if the greatest threat in space is not what's out there, but the story we carry with us? Let's frame the inquiry carefully. When you read Lovecraft's fiction, you won't find him railing against steam engines or raging at laboratories. He's not a Luddite smashing looms. He fears what scientific discovery implies: our insignificance, the fragility of meaning, the possibility that enlightenment is just a candle briefly held against an infinite dark. Progress, as a story, positions humans as protagonists climbing a grand staircase. From the Enlightenment's reason to the Industrial Revolution's power, from the digital age's connectivity to the space age's boundless frontier. Lovecraft's Cosmos says there is no staircase, just a cliff edge we only notice when the fog finally clears. So here's our core question. Is Lovecraft's fear a reactionary rejection of modernity, the anxiety of a xenophobic recluse clinging to a lost world? Or is it a sober warning about the myths we tell ourselves, the narratives that comfort us into complacency? To answer that, we need to parse what progress actually means. Start with the metrics. Life expectancy has more than doubled globally since 1800. Extreme poverty, which trapped roughly 80 to 90% of humanity 2 centuries ago, now affects less than 10%, even accounting for methodological debates and recent setbacks. Literacy has exploded. Infant mortality has plummeted. As economist Angus Deaton documents in The Great Escape, these are real gains, measurable and enormous. Our World in Data, a project led by Max Roser and Hannah Ritchie, offers transparent, well-sourced visualizations of these long-run trends. The numbers are not myths, but then there's the myth layered on top of the numbers. The narrative of inevitability, of destiny. The idea that history bends toward justice, that technology is a ladder we climb together, that each generation necessarily stands on the shoulders of the last and reaches higher. This is where techno-optimism lives, the belief that innovation broadly improves life, that the arc is long but bends toward flourishing. Steven Pinker has become the most prominent voice for this view, marshalling data on declining violence, rising wealth, and expanding rights in books like Enlightenment Now. On the other side sits techno-pessimism, which focuses on harm, limits, and unintended consequences. Philosopher John Gray argues in Straw Dogs that Enlightenment humanism smuggled in a secular salvation story, progress as redemption, without admitting it was still a faith. Gray claims we've replaced religious eschatology with technological eschatology, but the structure is the same. Suffer now, paradise later. Lovecraft, writing decades before Gray, intuited something similar. His materialist worldview left no room for divine plans, but he saw that people acted as if science would deliver them. He found that faith unsettling. Our task in this film is not to pick sides, but to ask, which parts of the story are evidence, and which parts are comfort, and when should comfort be distrusted? S.T. Joshi, Lovecraft's definitive biographer, notes that Lovecraft embraced scientific materialism. He believed the universe operated by physical laws, no gods required. Yet that very materialism led him to cosmic indifferentism, the stance that human concerns are not woven into the fabric of reality. We matter to ourselves. The stars don't care. If the numbers say life is better, why do so many of you feel the abyss is closer? To understand where we are, you need to rewind the tape. The idea of progress as a guiding narrative is not ancient. For most of human history, time was cyclical. Seasons turned, empires rose and fell, and the wise expected the wheel to keep spinning. The Enlightenment broke the wheel. Thinkers like Condorcet, writing in 1795 even as the French Revolution consumed itself, articulated a vision of cumulative improvement. Reason, science, and education could perfectibilize humanity. Each generation would know more, live better, die later. Linear time replaced the circle. The Industrial Revolution made improvement tangible and terrible all at once. You got railways, electric light, and the ability to produce goods at scales unimaginable a century earlier. You also got urban squalor, child labor, air thick with coal smoke, and the first inkling that power over nature might come with a bill. Robert Nisbet, in his intellectual history of the idea of progress, traces how 19th century thinkers oscillated between utopian confidence and Malthusian dread. The machine could liberate or crush, often it did both. Then came the fusion of scientific progress with eugenics. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the movement to engineer better humans gained respectability in the United States and Europe. It metastasized into forced sterilization laws, validated by the U.S. Supreme Court in Buck v. Bell in 1927. The same decade Lovecraft was writing cosmic horror, and into race science that would help justify atrocities. Daniel Kevles' In the Name of Eugenics documents how the language of improvement became a weapon. Progress betrayed its Enlightenment promise the moment it declared some lives more worthy of a future than others. The world wars tightened the knot. Physics birthed both the wonder of relativity and the annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Medicine advanced trauma care even as it learned from experiments conducted in concentration camps. Progress became a double-edged myth, oscillating between utopia and catastrophe. Sheila Jasanoff, in The Ethics of Invention, argues that every technology embeds ethical choices. often invisible until the consequences arrive. The choice isn't whether to invent, but how to govern what we invent and who gets to decide. It's worth noting that the linear, triumphalist narrative of progress is not universal. Buddhist thought emphasizes impermanence and cyclical existence. The notion of an ever-upward march would seem strange, even hubristic in that framework. Confucian and Islamic Golden Age traditions show sophisticated science and medicine entwined with virtue ethics and stewardship, not destiny narratives. The point isn't to flatten these rich traditions into simple contrast, but to ask, how do different civilizations balance capability with meaning? When does the story of more become a substitute for the question of why? Lovecraft was writing in the 1920s and 30s, an era when modernity's skyscraper awe sat beside economic collapse, the rise of fascism, and xenophobic immigration laws in the United States. It was a time ripe for cosmic dread, not because people were ignorant, but because they could see the shape of the future and weren't sure it had room for them. When better humans became law, did progress betray itself or reveal itself? Now we enter the life of the man himself. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. An amateur astronomer, a fierce materialist, a letter writer of staggering volume, and a creator of fictions in which knowledge is the gateway to madness. Lovecraft loved the night sky with the passion of someone who felt more at home among the stars than among people. And yet, as S.T. Joshi documents exhaustively in I Am Providence, Lovecraft detested many of his contemporaries, particularly immigrants, people of color, anyone who threatened his imagined Anglo-Saxon cultural purity. His letters are laced with xenophobic and racist language that reflected both his personal neuroses and the nativist fervor of 1920s America. We have to name this plainly. Lovecraft's personal bigotry inflects his monsters with racialized anxieties. The degenerate cultists in The Call of Cthulhu, the swarthy foreigners in The Horror at Red Hook. These are not accidental descriptors. They reveal a man who feared the other not cosmically, but socially. This is a serious limit on using him as any kind of moral guide. His philosophy of cosmic indifferentism, his argument that the universe doesn't care about human concerns, sits uncomfortably beside his very human prejudice. And yet, the philosophical core remains useful if we handle it carefully. Lovecraft argued that the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown, and his fiction dramatizes what happens when the unknown becomes known. In The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, a scholar pieces together reports of strange dreams, cultic activity, and an ancient entity sleeping beneath the Pacific. The more he learns, the less he can function. Knowledge doesn't liberate him, it unravels him. In The Color Out of Space, a meteor brings something utterly alien to a New England farm. Science can describe the symptoms: blighted crops, mutated animals, a family driven mad, but cannot contain the phenomenon. Discovery becomes synonymous with doom. Lovecraft's protagonists are often academics, antiquarians, scientists, people who believed in the Enlightenment bargain that knowledge brings mastery. Instead, they find that the cosmos operates on scales and principles indifferent to human thriving. This is cosmic indifferentism, or cosmicism, the idea that we are not the center, not the point, not even a footnote in the universe's ledger. We are accidents of chemistry on a wet rock. Why does this matter in the 21st century? Because you are living through a similar decentering. Artificial intelligence systems can now perform tasks, translate languages, diagnose diseases, generate art that once seemed definitionally human. You can make them, but you cannot always explain why they work, especially as models scale. Genomic editing lets you rewrite the code of life with CRISPR, but predicting all downstream effects is beyond current capability. Climate models show tipping points and feedback loops we can describe, but not yet control. Lovecraft didn't fear gadgets. He feared the psychological and existential vertigo that comes when your maps no longer match the territory, when you realize you're not the protagonist of the cosmos. You're an observer trying not to get crushed by the plot. Michel Houellebecq, in his provocative essay, H P Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, argues that Lovecraft's dread is fundamentally about the collapse of anthropocentrism. Once you accept that the universe doesn't care, what justifies your moral claims? Your ambitions? Your species? Houellebecq's reading is literary and polemical, not scientific, but it captures the stakes. Lovecraft's horror is existential vertigo, so we return to the tension. Lovecraft the person was a bigot whose fears curdled into prejudice. Lovecraft the writer articulated a fear that transcends his personal failures. The fear that progress doesn't kill you, but makes you strangers to yourselves. That the more you discover, the less you recognize the face in the mirror. That capability without meaning is a new kind of cosmic loneliness. What if progress doesn't kill us, but makes us strangers to ourselves? Let's switch lenses to psychology. Because the dread we're describing isn't purely philosophical, it's wired into your brain. Humans as a species dislike uncertainty. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. Your ancestors who treated rustling grass as a potential predator lived longer than those who shrugged it off. But in the modern world, that same intolerance of uncertainty can amplify threats that are abstract, distant, or probabilistic. R.N. Carlton's 2016 review of fear research identifies intolerance of uncertainty as a core transdiagnostic factor in anxiety disorders. When you can't predict what's coming, your threat detection systems stay switched on. Enter the availability heuristic, mapped by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in their foundational 1974 work on judgment under uncertainty. You judge the probability of an event not by running statistics, but by how easily examples come to mind. Plane crashes are memorable and rare. Car accidents are common and forgettable. So you fear flying more than driving, even though the data says you've got it backwards. When media, social networks, and cultural narratives loop the same catastrophic scenarios, rogue AI, designer pandemics, ecological collapse, they become available, and availability feels like probability. Then there's negativity bias. Baumeister and colleagues, in a 2001 review, show that bad is stronger than good. Losses loom larger than gains, threats command more attention than opportunities, and negative information sticks in memory more than positive. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. Missing a reward costs you a meal. Missing a threat costs you your life. But it means your default setting is to weight the downside of progress more heavily than the upside. Paul Slovik's research on risk perception, codified in his 1987 framework, reveals that people rate risks higher when they are unknown, uncontrollable, and catastrophic, even if the statistical base rate is low. Nuclear meltdowns, bioterrorism, superintelligent AI, these tick all three boxes. You don't have personal experience with them, you can't do much individually to prevent them, and if they happen, the consequences are civilizational. Compare that to car accidents or heart disease, which kill far more people but feel mundane. Slovik's dread factor explains why you might feel more afraid of CRISPRed superbugs than of the flu, despite the flu's annual body count. Sociologically, Kasperson and colleagues introduced the concept of social amplification of risk in 1988. Risk isn't just an objective probability. It's mediated by institutions, media, and culture. A single alarming story can ripple outward, amplified by each retelling, until public perception far exceeds the technical estimate. Conversely, risks can be attenuated, downplayed or ignored if they lack narrative salience, or if powerful actors have incentives to minimize them. The point is that your perception of progress and its dangers is never raw data. It's always shaped by the ecosystem of messages you swim in. There's even a micro-level analog to Lovecraftian dread, the uncanny valley. Masahiro Mori proposed in 1970 that as robots or CGI characters become more human-like, your affinity increases until they get almost human, at which point revulsion spikes. Then, if they cross fully into indistinguishability, comfort returns. The valley is the zone of the almost but not quite, the familiar rendered strange. It's a miniature version of the decentering anxiety Lovecraft dramatized. The thing that looks like you, but isn't. The AI that writes like a poet but has no inner life. The gene-edited embryo that's human, but edited. The sense that you're looking at your own reflection and it's looking back with eyes that don't recognize you. The key insight, your fear isn't irrational. Much of it is calibrated to real uncertainties. But your mind is tuned for survival in small-scale, face-to-face societies, not for navigating exponential curves or civilizational-scale risks. When you experience Lovecraftian dread about technology, you're often feeling the mismatch between ancestral intuitions and the modern condition. You're an ape asked to think like a god, but you still dream like an ape. Are we fearing the tech, or our own inability to predict ourselves around it? Progress needs promoters. So do doubts. And both have learned the same playbook. In 1928, Edward Bernays published Propaganda, a manual that fused Freudian psychology with mass persuasion. Bernays understood that you don't convince people with facts alone. You shape the environment in which they make choices. He helped corporations sell cigarettes to women by framing smoking as liberation. He helped governments sell wars by framing them as crusades. His insight was simple and chilling. If you control the narrative infrastructure, you don't need to lie outright. You just make certain conclusions feel inevitable. Jacques Ellul took Bernays' insight further. In his 1965 work, Propaganda, Ellul argued that modern propaganda isn't just advertising or state messaging. It's the creation of a total environment of symbols, stories, and assumptions that make some choices appear rational and others unthinkable. Propaganda, in Ellul's view, works by integration. It aligns your desires with the needs of the system. You're not coerced. You're convinced that what the system wants is what you want. And because the environment is total, you can't step outside to see it. Let's apply this to progress. During the atomic age, the US government launched the Atoms for Peace campaign. The same technology that leveled cities would, the story went, power homes, cure cancer, and green deserts. Civil defense films oscillated between reassurance, duck and cover and you'll be fine, and barely veiled terror. The narrative machinery worked to domesticate the bomb, to make living with annihilation feel normal. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used space imagery to the same end. Asif Siddiqui's challenge to Apollo documents how the USSR's Sputnik and Gagarin missions were as much propaganda as engineering, proof that the socialist system could out-innovate the West. Both superpowers told their citizens that technological supremacy equaled moral legitimacy. Progress became a Cold War weapon. In your time, the same dynamics play out around artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Hype cycles ping-pong between AI will cure all disease and end scarcity, and AI will kill everyone and end history. Often these messages come from the same actors, researchers, entrepreneurs, and advocates who benefit from attention, investment, and crucially, the shaping of regulation. Sheila Jasanoff notes in The Ethics of Invention that narratives about technology are never neutral. They carry implicit assumptions about who benefits, who decides, and what counts as progress. The rhetoric of inevitability is especially powerful. This is coming whether we like it or not, so we'd better get on board. Once you accept inevitability, you stop asking whether the thing should happen and start arguing only about how to manage it. Recognizing the machinery doesn't mean rejecting progress. It means asking, who benefits from this story right now? When a billionaire tells you that colonizing Mars is humanity's destiny, ask who profits from the rockets. When a pundit tells you that AI safety research is a distraction from real harms like algorithmic bias, ask who benefits from slowing or accelerating which kinds of oversight. When a government tells you that surveillance technology is the only way to keep you safe, ask what rights are traded for that safety and whether the trade is reversible. The propaganda of progress and the propaganda of doom are mirror images. Both short-circuit deliberation. Both replace the question, what should we do, with what must we accept? Lovecraft's cosmic horror was a narrative too, a story that said, inquiry leads to madness. It was persuasive precisely because it tapped into anxieties that the Enlightenment story couldn't accommodate. Doubt, limits, the possibility of knowledge without redemption. Your job, as someone navigating these narratives, is to hold them lightly. Treat every story of salvation and every story of apocalypse as a hypothesis, not a gospel. If every miracle needs a marketing team, how do we tell discovery from spin? Now, you're present. You live in an era when capability is scaling faster than your ethical, legal, and psychological infrastructure can track. Start with artificial intelligence. In the last decade, deep learning has delivered systems that can match or exceed human performance on image recognition, language translation, game playing, protein folding, and even aspects of creative work. Scale has brought emergent capabilities, behaviors that researchers didn't explicitly program and sometimes can't fully explain. Large language models, for instance, can reason by analogy, generate coherent long-form text, and exhibit what looks like common sense, all learned from vast corpora of human language. The question of catastrophic risk remains hotly debated. Joseph Carlsmith, in a 2022 report for Open Philanthropy, attempts to quantify the probability that power-seeking AI could pose an existential threat this century. He estimates non-trivial risk on the order of several percentage points, but he's explicit about the uncertainty. The model chains together speculative steps. Will we build systems capable of outmaneuvering human institutions? Will they pursue goals misaligned with human welfare? Can we fail to stop them? Each link in the chain is uncertain, and the uncertainties compound. Critics, including economists Eric Brynjolfsson and Tom Mitchell, and computer scientists Joy Bolamwini and Timnit Gebru, argue that these long-term speculative scenarios can distract from near-term measurable harms. Algorithmic bias that denies loans or targets policing labor displacement, without safety nets, concentration of power in a handful of corporations and nations. Bolamwini and Gebru's 2018 gender shades study showed that commercial facial recognition systems had error rates for dark-skinned women up to 34% higher than for light-skinned men, a concrete, present harm. Both concerns can be true. The long-term and the near-term aren't mutually exclusive, but the rhetoric around AI often forces a binary. Either you're a doomer convinced that superintelligence will annihilate us, or you're a booster convinced that any regulation will stifle innovation. The truth is more boring and more urgent. You need governance frameworks that can handle both the systems you have now and the systems you might build soon. You need transparency, accountability, and the ability to pull the emergency brake. Turn to biotechnology. CRISPR gene editing, awarded the Nobel Prize in 2020, gives you the ability to rewrite DNA with precision unimaginable a generation ago. You can knock out genes that cause sickle cell disease. You can engineer mosquitoes that can't transmit malaria. In 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced that he had edited the genomes of twin girls to confer resistance to HIV. The scientific community reacted with near-universal condemnation, not because the editing failed technically, but because it raced ahead of ethical consensus, safety assurance, and regulatory oversight. He was later sentenced to prison in China. The case, documented by Jennifer Doudna and Samuel Sternberg in A Crack in Creation and in Nature Reporting, illustrates a dangerous gap. The capability exists, but the governance does not. Can has outrun should. The rhetoric of inevitability often accompanies these technologies. You hear that AI development is a race. If we don't do it, China will. If China doesn't, someone else will. You hear that gene editing is already happening in labs around the world, so regulation is futile. This is a narrative choice, not a fact. Nick Bostrom introduced the concept of differential technological development in a 2002 paper. The idea that you should try to accelerate safer, more beneficial technologies and slow, riskier ones. It's a steering problem, not a brake problem. You don't stop research, you shape its trajectory. Jack Stilgoe, Richard Owen, and Phil McNaghan, in their 2013 framework on responsible innovation, argue for anticipation, reflexivity, inclusion, and responsiveness, building in feedback loops and stakeholder voices from the start, rather than waiting for catastrophe to prompt regulation. Lovecraft's fear wasn't of gadgets. It was of narratives that remap human significance. Stories that say, this is bigger than you, inevitable, and you don't get to steer. You are living that fear now. AI systems that can write, diagnose, and predict better than you in some domains. Genetic tools that can edit the blueprint of life. Both come wrapped in inevitability rhetoric, often by actors who benefit from that framing. The question is not whether these technologies exist. They do. The question is whether you can govern them in a way that preserves meaning, dignity, and agency. Whether you can call the bluff on inevitable and replace it with chosen. What if the scariest word in technology isn't superintelligence, it's inevitable? Let's anchor the abstraction in history. Progress is not a thought experiment. It has a body count and a resume. We'll look at 3 moments when the promise of advancement and the reality of suffering existed in the same frame, not as opposites, but as 2 faces of the same transformation. In 1868, Japan emerged from centuries of relative isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate. The new Meiji government faced a stark choice: modernize rapidly or risk colonization by Western powers. Japan chose speed. Within a generation, you saw railways crisscrossing the islands, factories rising, a conscript army trained on European models, and a public education system that turned peasants into citizens. By 1905, Japan defeated Russia in war, a non-Western power besting a European empire. On paper, it was a triumph. But novelist Natsume Soseki captured the human cost. In Kokoro, published in 1914, he writes of a generation caught between inherited Confucian values and the atomized individualism of modernity. The protagonist's mentor, sensei, is paralyzed by guilt and alienation, unable to reconcile the old moral order with the new. Carol Gluck's Japan's Modern Myths examines how the Meiji state constructed narratives of unity and destiny to smooth over these fractures. But the fractures remained. Modernization brought power and dislocation in the same breath. You became stronger and lonelier at once. King Leopold II of Belgium acquired the Congo as a personal possession under the guise of a humanitarian and civilizing mission. The rhetoric was progress. Bring Christianity, commerce, and enlightenment to darkest Africa. The reality was extraction. Rubber quotas enforced by terror. Villages burned. Hands severed as proof of bullets spent. The system was designed for profit, not people. Roger Casement's 1904 report to the British government documented the atrocities in clinical detail. Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost later synthesized archival evidence and survivor testimony into a damning narrative. An estimated 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule, though exact numbers remain contested due to poor records and deliberate obfuscation. Here, the story of improvement justified the worst. Civilizing mission was propaganda for plunder. Progress became a cloak for barbarism, and crucially, it worked for decades, because the narrative infrastructure in Europe presented Leopold as a philanthropist. The lesson: when power wraps itself in the language of progress, you need to ask who is counting the costs and who is being counted out. Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward with the goal of vaulting China into modernity. Collectivized agriculture, backyard steel furnaces, and utopian rhetoric promised to overtake the West within years. The result was systemic failure. Grain production collapsed. Famine spread. Bureaucratic pressure to meet impossible quotas led to false reporting, which led to more impossible quotas. The feedback loops that might have corrected course were silenced by ideology. Estimates of excess deaths vary widely. Yang Jisheng's tombstone, based on Chinese archival work, suggests around 36 million. Frank Dikötter's Mao's Great Famine estimates 45 million. The methodologies are debated, and political sensitivities in China limit full archival access, but the scale is undeniable. Tens of millions dead in a crisis amplified by the story that speed and will could overcome material reality. The lesson here is not that ambition is bad. It's that when ideology moves faster than feedback, when the story of progress becomes unchallengeable, you get catastrophe. Lovecraft anthropomorphized that dynamic as incomprehensible entities that drive you mad. History shows you don't need cosmic monsters. Hubris suffices. Across cultures and centuries, progress is neither angel nor demon. It is power, the capacity to reshape the world. And power magnifies error. When you move fast and break things, sometimes the thing you break is millions of lives. The Lovecraftian horror isn't that progress is evil. It's that progress is indifferent to your good intentions. The cosmos doesn't care if you meant well. If good intentions aren't enough, what upgrades do our narratives need? We must entertain the counterpoint, because the critique of progress can itself become a trap. Cynicism is easy, building is hard, and the data on human welfare over the last 2 centuries is not a mirage. Start with extreme poverty. In 1820, roughly 80 to 90% of humanity lived in conditions we would now define as extreme poverty. Barely enough food, no access to clean water, lifespans in the 30s. Today, despite a global population that has ballooned from 1 billion to 8 billion, less than 10% live in extreme poverty, even after accounting for the setbacks of COVID-19 and regional conflicts. The World Bank's definitions and methods have evolved and faced criticism. Purchasing power parity calculations are imperfect, and 2.15 a day is an absurdly low bar for a dignified life. But the directional trend is robust. People are living longer, eating more reliably, and escaping subsistence. Life expectancy tells a similar story. Globally, it has risen from around 30 years in 1800 to over 70 today. This isn't just rich countries. Even low-income nations have seen dramatic gains. Vaccines, antibiotics, sanitation, and oral rehydration therapy, simple, scalable interventions, have saved hundreds of millions of lives. Angus Deaton, in The Great Escape, emphasizes that this escape from early death and grinding poverty is real, but also fragile and uneven. New inequalities emerge between countries, within countries, and in access to the next wave of medical innovation. Literacy, another measure. In 1800, fewer than 15% of adults could read. Today, over 85% can. Education is not a panacea. Literacy can coexist with propaganda, as the 20th century showed, but it expands the horizon of possibility. It lets you read a medicine label, a legal contract, or a dissenting pamphlet. Steven Pinker, in The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, argues that violence has also declined over the long run. Fewer deaths from war, homicide, and state persecution per capita. Critics, including political economist Christopher Kramer, caution that these trends are fragile, regionally uneven, and vulnerable to reversal. The The 20th century included industrialized slaughter on a scale Pinker's long-run averages can obscure. Still, the claim isn't that we live in paradise. It's that we live in a world where more people have more opportunities to escape suffering than at any prior point. So why does this matter for our inquiry? Because fear of progress can become a cloak for preserving unjust hierarchies. The argument, things might get worse, so don't change anything, is often made by those who benefit from the status quo. Lovecraftian dread, taken too far, curdles into paralysis or reactionary nostalgia. If you reject all forward motion because it carries risk, you also reject the possibility of curing diseases, mitigating climate change, or lifting people out of poverty. The fair synthesis recognizes that skepticism without alternatives is not wisdom, it's a mood. The gains of the last 2 centuries are real, but they are not automatic. They required effort, institutions, conflict, and course corrections. Deaton points out that the great escape is ongoing. Some people are still escaping, others are falling behind, and the mechanisms that worked in one era may not work in the next. What if the bravest stance isn't optimism or pessimism, but maintenance? So how do you move forward? Not naively, not paralyzed, but with eyes open. We can synthesize the insights from philosophy, psychology, history, and governance research into a practical stance, a maturity model for progress. Step 1. Epistemic humility. Treat forecasts as distributions, not destinies. Philip Tetlock and Dan Gardner's super forecasting shows that the best predictors are not the ones with the loudest certainty. They're the ones who update incrementally, track their errors, and quantify their uncertainty. When someone tells you that AGI will arrive in 5 years or never, ask them for confidence intervals and falsifiable criteria. When you make your own predictions, include error bars. Lovecraft's protagonists go mad because they mistake partial maps for total truth. Don't make their mistake. Step 2. Differential technological development. Not all progress is equal. Some capabilities buy you time to develop others. Nick Bostrom's framework suggests accelerating safety, governance, and interpretability research, while slowing or scrutinizing capabilities that could cause irreversible harm, especially when deployed at scale before we understand them. This is hard politically and economically because the incentives often favor racing, but it's conceptually straightforward. You don't want the brakes to arrive after the crash. Step 3. Responsible innovation. Jack Stilgoe and colleagues propose 4 pillars. Anticipation. Imagine how things could go wrong. Reflexivity. Question your own assumptions and interests. Inclusion. Bring affected communities into decisions early. And responsiveness. Build feedback loops so you can course correct. This isn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It's resilience engineering. You build in the capacity to notice and adapt before small errors compound into catastrophes. Reversibility and observability matter. Can you undo this if it goes wrong? Can you see it going wrong in time? Step 4. Narrative hygiene. Avoid inevitability rhetoric. When you hear, "This is coming whether we like it or not," ask who benefits from that framing. Declare interests and uncertainties openly. Red team your own assumptions. Assign someone to argue the opposite and take them seriously. This is standard practice in intelligence analysis and increasingly in AI safety research. CISA, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has published frameworks for red teaming AI systems, treating them as adversarial environments. Apply that mindset to the stories you tell about progress. Assume the story has blind spots. Go looking for them. Step 5. Meaning maintenance. Meaning. Pair capability gains with cultural and ethical work. Progress without a meaning arc breeds dread. This is where the Lovecraft lens is most useful. His fear was that scientific discovery would strip life of significance. Your response is not to stop discovering, but to choose significance. Anchor progress in purposes that matter. Care, beauty, stewardship, flourishing. These are not metrics you can optimize, but they are orientations you can protect. When you ask, why are we building this? And the answer is only because we can, you're on dangerous ground. Revisit the core question now. Lovecraft feared that progress strips us of meaning. Our answer is conditional. Progress steals meaning only when you outsource meaning to power. When you let capability curves dictate your values. When you let inevitable replace chosen. When you stop asking, should we? Because you're too busy asking, how fast? Keep the steering wheel human, collective, and transparent. Make space for doubt, dissent, and correction. Move forward, but move carefully. You're not climbing a staircase to the stars. You're navigating terrain that changes as you walk it. The map is incomplete. That's not a reason to stop walking. It's a reason to watch your step. If we can't predict the future, can we design our relationship to it? We return to the night sky. Lovecraft looked up through his telescope over Providence and saw indifference, a universe vast, cold, and empty of meaning. You look up now and see the James Webb Space Telescope's images, galaxies forming in the cosmic dawn, nebulae where stars are born, light that left its source billions of years before Earth existed. You see the same indifference, and yet you also see a fragile blue dot, a world where life clings to a thin shell of air and water, where 8 billion human stories are unfolding in this moment, and where meaning is not given, but made. The lesson isn't to fear progress. The lesson is to hold two truths without flinching. You are small, cosmically, trivially small, and you are responsible. The abyss does not care, but you do. And that caring is not weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this matter. Progress is not redemption. It's a tool, and tools take the shape of the hands that wield them. If you build better stories, ones that pair capability with humility, power with purpose, speed with care, you can step beyond fear without denying it. You can recognize the abyss without leaping into it or pretending it isn't there. You can say, yes, the universe is indifferent, but we are not the universe. We are the part of the universe that woke up and noticed. That's not a small thing. You don't need to be at the center of the cosmos to make meaning at the edge of it. You don't need destiny to justify your choices. You need attention, humility, and the courage to steer even when the map runs out. Lovecraft's fiction was a warning. Knowledge without meaning is madness. Your task is to prove him wrong, not by rejecting knowledge, but by choosing, again and again, what knowledge is for. So, where should your curiosity go next? What risks deserve your best caution? And what possibilities deserve your boldest hope? What kind of ancestor do you want progress to make you? Not a warning carved in stone for future archaeologists, but a living example of a species that learned to hold power carefully. That moved fast sometimes and slow sometimes, and knew the difference. That looked into the abyss and said, "We see you, and we're not impressed." Before you click away, sit with this. What kind of ancestor do you want progress to make you? If this kind of deep dive cinematic essay resonated with you, if you're someone who wants evidence, nuance, and a little cosmic dread with your morning coffee, subscribe for more and drop a comment. Where do you see the line between healthy caution and paralyzing fear in today's technologies? What story would you write to keep us on track? Let's figure this out together.